back to my channel. So now we are going to see the solution for a new question number 4, which is grant service account monitoring SCA in a specific namespace cluster-wide permissions to list and get pods in all namespaces using appropriate cluster role and cluster role binding. So if you closely observe this question, previously we have solved the service account using role and role bindings. But if you have to basically give a specific service account, basically difference between service account and user is user will be confined to global, like entire cluster, but the service account is confined to a specific namespace. And if you want to grant permissions of for a service account for all the namespaces for specific actions, you have to use cluster roles. And in order to bind the service account and cluster role, you have to use cluster role binding. Since cluster role is applied for entire cluster, and a you and the service account is for a specific namespace, you have to use a cluster role binding to bind the service account and cluster role. So that is a little bit of theory. You can just go through this in a GitHub. I have already added here. So okay, so if at all you use cluster role, you use role binding instead of cluster role binding to attach a cluster role to a service account, it will confine that role binding, that permissions to specific one single namespace only. Okay, and instead of a role binding, if you use a cluster role binding, it will bind that uh, so that you will be allowed for the permissions for entire cluster. So that is a difference if you use for cluster role binding and role binding for a service account. And so let's get started with this question. So basically they ask to create a namespace under which we will be having a service account. So generally to create a namespace we use like create namespace and monitoring, and you can also verify it using get namespace. You will see this monitoring namespace is there. So inside this namespace, I want a service account. So you can always use a create service account, and in the namespace monitoring, and the name of the service account, which they specified in the question as monitoring SCA. So I'll just paste it here. So this way I'll create a service account, and let's create it. And this next step is to create this cluster role. So even for the cluster role you can do k create cluster role hyphen hyphen help. So you will get an example here using a cluster role onto which you are applying is for uh, list of all pods, right? So you will be adding here like a cluster role which is naming of in question as they didn't give any cluster role, is it name? You can give like any cluster role. My cluster role 1, and they asked us to grant for list and get permissions of the pods, and we can remove this, and the resource will be of pods here. And so let's create a cluster role first. So I'll just paste it and create a cluster role. So the cluster role is created. The thing is I have to bind the cluster role with the a service account. So I'll use a cluster role binding, and for that I'll use create cluster role binding in a names. Okay, in a help command. So using this help command there is an option where you can give this way. Okay, so there are different ways you can add, and so similarly, I will add, and this is okay. It's not copied properly, is it? Cluster role binding, and I'll just copy paste this. And instead of users, now I'm using a service account. So if you are not sure of that, they have given you an example here how to create using this service account. Hyphen hyphen service account. Where is my service account? It's in the monitoring namespace, and my service account name is monitoring SCA. Okay, so this way I can create my cluster role binding. Okay, so this is already existing. I'll use as my cluster role binding one. So I hope this should be fine. Okay, so you can verify using cluster role bindings. Here, if you search for my cluster role binding one, it has binded to my cluster role. So I think we are good. You can proceed with further testing using KAuth as we have did for earlier questions. So I just don't want to explain how we can get the entire thing. You can just do KAuth can I list and then hyphen hyphen help, and you can ping as a user also as we did for question 3. You can also check using the system call and service account. If you do hyphen hyphen help, you will get an option there to do in this way. So basically, this is like in a default namespace you are checking because you applied using a service command, but you are checking whether it is applying to default namespace as well. Service account is for monitoring. So will you be able to list the pods in default namespace because you applied cluster role, which is for entire cluster and binded with cluster role binding? Yes. And when you try the another thing like auth can I list the pods in a cube system? Yes, that is also in that namespace also it is allowed. And can you list the pods, all the pods, all the pods in without any namespace? Like yes. So because we enabled for list and get, those will be applied for all the namespaces. But can you do a delete operation on any of the namespace, which we not specified in the cluster role? So it shows as no, you can't perform the delete operation on the pods because you have not given the access in that role. So yes, that's all from the solution for this question number 4. And coming forward, we'll see for the fifth question. So thank you so much. Bye bye.